Pay attention to the music that plays here. This song plays specifically in the underwater ruins, in this area in the flooded forest, and only while you and the camera are submerged. It's not something you'd usually pick up on while playing the game. The only reason you'd be swimming here is to typically fight monsters or to quickly get out of the water to traverse onto land. Little details like this are a testament to the amount of care put into the underwater areas when they were introduced in Monster Hunter Tri. Despite the lengths the team, led by Konami Fujioka, went to making the underwater areas engaging and immersive, there were definitely things they did with the game that weren't as polished, specifically when it came to the underwater combat. In today's video, I want to go in depth and discuss everything when it comes to underwater in Monster Hunter. The different features that are available, the aesthetics, and the interactability, what they did right, what they did wrong, to ultimately answer the question of, should underwater combat return to the series, and if so, how that would be implemented to the newer generation of Monster Hunter games. There's a lot to go over today, so sit back and enjoy a more laid-back video on the Flyann 2 channel. Let's take a step back and go over the history of Monster Hunter in regards to when underwater combat was released. Monster Hunter can be split up into multiple generations, separated by the release of mainline games. The original Monster Hunter would be the first generation, Monster Hunter DOS the second, and in the third generation would be when underwater was introduced with Monster Hunter Tri. The third generation would have 3 games in total: Tri, Monster Hunter Portable Third, and Monster Hunter 3 Ultimate. The only game out of these 3 without underwater areas or underwater combat was Portable Third, which only came out in Japan on the PSP to be later remastered on the PS3, but we'll go over that game at a later point in this video. Once Monster Hunter Tri dropped in Japan in the year 2009, aside from the huge addition of including underwater combat alongside the regular grounded combat, the third generation of games had a complete upgrade in visuals in general, animations, textures, and complete redesigns of Rathian and Rathalos to look a bit meatier. Tri was a huge visual upgrade from the first and second generation, especially if you compare it to the portable titles. With the brand new visuals came new maps, and the game included 4 different water-based areas: Deserted Island, Flooded Forest, the Water Arena for arena quests, and the 3-part area where you fight the Elder Dragon Ceadeus. In Monster Hunter 3 Ultimate, this area is also where you fight his subspecies, Goldbeard Ceadeus, and the underwater-only version of the game's flagship, Abyssal Lagiacrus. In 3 Ultimate, a 5th water-based area was added, dubbed the Tainted Sea, and it's an arena where you fight the final boss of the game, Dire Miralis. Overall, I'd say the biggest addition with the introduction of 3rd Gen is the freedom of movement through underwater. The biggest difference between land and sea is the fact that your hunter can move vertically. Now, there are some issues with the movement. It definitely wasn't perfect. There's a lot to talk about there, but there's a lot of nuances that I won't get into until later. Verticality would later be introduced on land in Monster Hunter 4, which would bring climbing, aerial combat, and mounting to Monster Hunter, another big jump for the series. But for vertical movement in general, Monster Hunter Tri was the first to do it. Like most Monster Hunter games, Monster Hunter Tri has its own unique village, and that would be the quaint Moga village. Moga, aside from the earthquakes that plague it caused by the Elder Dragon Ceadeus, is a quiet and peaceful fishing village attached to an archipelago within a great ocean. This little village sets the tone for the underwater areas to come, immersive, soothing, with an air of mystery and the occasional bouts of panic. Attached to Moga Village is arguably one of the best maps they've ever created, D.Island. No, not Monkey D.Island, Deserted Island. And the island is quite literally that. An ancient Moga village used to reside here, before most of it got submerged underwater. It can be visited through specific quests or can be explored freely behind Moga Village itself. The area is littered with little secrets, shortcuts, and a variety of visually stunning locations, from open plains to caves and cliffs, and of course its areas submerged underwater. The actual areas you can enter or remain underwater are Areas 10, 11, and 12, and the shortcut in the base camp. You can also enter Area 11 by jumping off the cliff in Area 8, and you can go straight back to Area 8 by climbing up a vine, which is a shortcut I was unaware of for an embarrassingly long time. Area 10 acts as the divider between land and sea for this map, and in the Lagiacrus lair in Area 12, you can swim onto land to do some fighting or mining. There are some neat things you can do underwater when it comes to the deserted island, but before I get into that, let's just talk about some specific underwater features in general. I think one of my personal favorite differences between being on land and being underwater is the fact that certain gestures are significantly different. Here are some of the ones with notable differences compared to the grounded ones. My favorite out of all of them has to be Lament. Definitely reflects how I feel after not getting the drop I wanted. These gestures are animated so well, I love the charm they all have. A small change also is that the kick you can do on land is a shoulder tackle underwater. Maybe our armor is too heavy for us to use our leggies. Sprinting on land is replaced by super quick swimming when in combat. Rolling on land is replaced by dashing underwater, and you can no longer do the invulnerable Superman dive. You just do a long dash instead. When it came to underwater combat, instead of invincibility frames, it seems they wanted hunters to focus on positioning instead. Certain items cannot be used underwater. For example, you can't eat meat, or use the barbecue spit to cook said meat. Very sad. If SpongeBob can light a fire underwater, why can't we? Actually, we sort of can with fire weapons. It does this cool green explosion instead, probably from the water filter that occurs when you're submerged. I think a neat little detail is the fact that they changed the blood effects to match what blood looks like when drawn underwater. Another item you can't use underwater are pitfall traps, but you can use shock traps. Instead of being placed flat on the ground, they take over a more sphere-like area. But much like shock traps on land, it's annoying to get monsters to go into the right spot, especially when dealing with the verticality that underwater offers. Barrel bombs can be placed underwater, but they are placed on their side instead, and kind of float around a little bit. A cute detail. Underwater introduced us to the fishing harpoon, which you can use to slay certain enemies in a specific way to gather specific materials. You just stab them to death, pretty much. A very niche tool that ends up breaking frequently. I really didn't use it too often, but I'm sure someone out there loves their harpoon. By jumping into the water next to a fishing spot, you can actually reset the fish, which is extremely useful for the hardest quest in the game, catching golden fish. If you don't already know, you're probably wondering how a hunter can even hunt underwater without drowning from a lack of oxygen. Well, there is an oxygen gauge on the left side, and when it diminishes to 0, you start slowly losing HP. Honestly, I've personally never paid too much attention to it, as there are so many different ways to refill it in-game that it doesn't even ever seem to be an issue. Swimming to bubbles littered around areas, using consumables, calling Cha-Cha over with a specific mass will all refill your oxygen gauge, as well as swimming up to the surface of the water. It's definitely a mechanic that once you get used to it, you really don't think about it too often. Relative to other games with oxygen systems, Monster Hunter is pretty forgiving. Back to swimming up to the surface, once you reach the top of the water, the visuals, sound effects, and music change. This also occurs if you move your camera up instead of having your character swim to the surface. Sometimes this could be useful for certain fights depending on the positioning of the monster you're facing, but most times it's disorienting and can definitely be a little janky. When it comes to underwater combat, this is one of the factors that contribute to it feeling clunky at times. Back to Deserted Island. In the base camp, there's a fishing spot, and next to it is the underwater shortcut I mentioned earlier that takes you straight to Area 9, which oddly enough is a land-only area. Once underwater, there are gathering points to collect certain items in Area 10, along with some marine life that hangs around. Depending on the season Moga, it could be some non-threatening enemies, or they can be replaced by some aggressive Ludrith. Little fishes swim around in certain spots and can get scared when you get too close. It might not seem like much, but little things like this really add to the immersiveness of underwater areas overall. I feel like Monster Hunter games have always been good with having endemic life that contributes to the feel of an area. One of the features that 3rd Gen used a lot that carried over to underwater combat is the destructible environments. You'd be surprised at how many things can actually break while fighting enemies, especially in the Deserted Island. When a Lagiacrus comes at you with a powerful hip check and hits a rock instead and it crumbles to dust, it's definitely intimidating. I done pooped my pants the first time that happened to me. Also, I was always a big fan of how large the fighting areas are underwater in Deserted Island. Having that much room to position yourself around monsters is what makes this one of my favorite maps to fight underwater in. Let's move on to one of the coolest maps visually in the series, the Flooded Forest. If you're newer to the series and have played Monster Hunter Rise, you should still be familiar with this place. The key difference though, aside from the fact that older generations had loading zones, is that the flooded aspects of Flooded Forest are actually swimmable. Areas 3, 5, and 6 are entirely submerged. If you eat for Feline Explorer in high rank or G rank, or just get lucky, you can end up in the secret area, which is a cave up above Area 6. You can jump into the water once you're done looting. Area 4 and Area 8 from the beginning of the video are areas where you can submerge yourself as well as go up back onto land. In the base camp, there's also a shortcut like in Deserted Island that leads to Area 6. Area 6 is the biggest area for underwater combat, so it makes sense that everything kind of funnels into it. Something that's really neat about the flooded forest is the contrast between the underwater zones in this map compared to the deserted island. The flooded forest is murky with its own unique flora and fauna. Coupled with the rain falling down and its incredible music and sounds, they nailed the atmosphere for this map. And I adore how this place looks at nighttime. The skyline is simply mesmerizing. Back underwater, the coolest thing about the vegetation is there are these antenna-looking plants on the ground. You can gather materials from here, and knowing this, gobles have evolved to have identical-looking antennas to trick prey into getting eaten. I always thought that was a cool detail they added for our frog-eating hero. In this map, there are plenty of spots to mine for some ore. I mean, if we can hunt underwater, may as well mine too. The flooded forest has an excellent aesthetic, but it falls short mechanically when it actually comes to the underwater areas you fight monsters in. The areas are cramped, hard to see at times, and with the water generally being pretty shallow, the camera can be wonky when it comes to the above and underwater cameras shifting. It doesn't help that oftentimes the plants in the foreground would cover the screen. Unfortunately, at this point, Monster Hunter didn't have the technology to fade things near the camera underwater, but I'm sure nowadays it could be implemented nicely. Overall, I think the larger areas in Deserted Island were designed better for actual underwater combat, despite how visually striking the flooded forest ended up being. The next area we're going to talk about is the underwater arena. There's not much to say for this place, it's pretty straightforward. You start in the same base camp arena like the other arena fights, and you get transported straight underwater. There's no room to traverse on land, any fights here are entirely submerged. The underwater arena is decently sized, I never found myself yearning for more space, but I'm sure I'd have an easier time if it was as big as Area 10 in Deserted Island. That's probably a little extreme though. The arena also features a Dragonator, but it's not available for every fight. Overall, I don't really have any complaints when it comes to fighting here. But now let's talk about the peak of underwater combat, both visually and within the mechanics of the fight. The underwater Ceadeus fight is incredible. After jumping off the base camp area, Moga Village sets up for you to face this formidable beast that's been terrorizing the village with earthquakes. You land into the first area. Here is a long and narrow path with light bleeding in from above, while a subdued version of the main fight theme plays. Ceadeus is a giant aquatic elder dragon with a large horn you can break. The horn is something that continues to grow and eventually grows over his eyes, one of which has already been covered at this point. It's actually why he keeps ramming around in this arena, which in turn causes earthquakes. The pain is too much for him to bear. Poor guy. Still gotta kill his ass though, sorry y'all, I ain't repellent. You can also break his fins and his beard. Breaking his beard is necessary to advance to the final phase of the fight. If you do it early, he zooms his way to the end to hip check the giant rock that leads to the final arena. But yeah, this fight has a beard DPS check. Awesome. The second area is also visually stunning with even more light coming in. Something interesting to note is that you actually do a little side quest before doing this fight to have Cha-Cha acquire the ancient mask that gives you oxygen, as I mentioned earlier in this video. You signal him through the menu to call him over and fill up your oxygen instantly. But honestly, it's not necessary for this fight. You can't go up to the surface to get air, but there are little oxygen bubbles on the ground that you can quickly swim to if things get too dire. The fight also supplies some mini oxygen consumables, so it's never really an issue. In the first two areas, Ceadeus doesn't do too much. He wiggles a little bit, maybe fires a couple giant lasers, but it's all build up for the climactic showdown in the final arena. He isn't messing around anymore, and he's gonna do a bunch of new moves and abilities to take you down. For an Elder Dragon that's low rank only, they really didn't mess around when it comes to this fight. We need to talk about this final arena you fight him in because it looks incredible. Surrounded by ancient ruins and rubble falling from the surface, this is where you have your decisive battle with Ceadeus. The arena is huge both horizontally and vertically. You can swim way up to the top to see the giant beam of light emitting from the surface, and if you sink to the bottom, you can see these bioluminescent organisms glowing. Maybe this is what he feasts on to fuel his own bioluminescent organs. There's wires running through the whole area, you can find oxygen spots to refuel, as well as many different crates to gather supplies, like the underwater ballista ammo to use with the ballistas placed within this arena. You know it's a real siege fight when these baddies are involved. And of course, who could forget the Dragonator, a huge damage source, but it can be a little difficult to land this on Ceadeus when he's not doing his specific routine of swimming up to it. Since the fight is only 30 minutes long, you don't want to skimp on damage. Oddly enough, it's the only siege fight that I'm aware of that lets you attempt it again if you only repel him instead of slaying, with him remaining at the same HP. You also skip the first phase of chasing him around since you've technically already done that with him in the previous fight, and skip straight to the final phase. Something interesting to note is that there is a shortcut to the entrance to the third area. It opens once you get him there. You can jump from the base camp, and even Chacha lets you know this shortcut exists. He mentions it a lot, actually. Monster Hunter Tri had a mechanic that wasn't present in any other third generation game, and that was the specific day and night cycle it had. You could still go on quests that are preset to day and night in other games, but Tri-Cycle even affected Moga Village, meaning if you left for a quest at nighttime within Moga Village or Loklak, that quest would be set to its nighttime iteration. So essentially, by leaving at nighttime, you could do fights like Gen Morin and Ceadeus in a nighttime area instead. What's cool about facing him at night is how visually different the entire area is. Torches are lit up in the base camp, and the gold light underwater is replaced by this incredible blue beam of light. It wasn't necessary for them to go to these lengths, but the little details like this are always appreciated. As far as I know, the nighttime area doesn't return in either the Goldbeard Ceadeus fight or the Abyssal Lagakris fight in the same area in 3 Ultimate. It was a shame they didn't use it for Abyssal in 3 Ultimate, since I feel like the arena would fit his color palette so well. Speaking of Goldbeard Ceadeus though, he's essentially the wall to get into G rank in 3 Ultimate. You skip the first fight and spawn right in the final area. He's got 2 big horns instead of 1, meaning he's completely blind. But that doesn't stop him from firing a bunch of lasers in new ways to vaporize your ass. It's a fun fight that lets you get right into the action from the get-go. But back to the regular Ceadeus. I think this entire area, this entire siege, the atmosphere, and the powerful music were the culmination of everything they did right with underwater combat. I truly believe it peaked with this, and I'd hope that this fight would be the standard of quality if they were to bring underwater combat back to the franchise. Let's not talk about the very last underwater area, and that is the Tainted Sea. This is where you fight the final boss that is exclusive to Monster Hunter 3 Ultimate, Dire Miralis. A very visually striking Elder Dragon with equally cool armor designs and weapons. Aesthetically very worthy to be the final real fight for 3 Ultimate. Unlike the Ceadeus fight, this battle is half on land and half underwater. He likes to switch between the two quite frequently. The base camp is a tiny area that you can only reach if you either cart or use a Farcaster, much like the Elatrion fight. I love the aesthetic of this area in general. The water is red and almost looks bloody, and the Port Tanzia lighthouse is literally on fire. What I find really cool visually is when you're underwater and he's on land, you can see the glowing flames glowing through his body. Very intimidating. There are plenty of ballistas to use in this area. You can even fire at Dire Miralis' head from land when he's underwater because he's that damn tall. There's plenty of crates to scavenge for ammo. You can even get some from the marooned boat. There are 2 Dragonators on this map, one on land and one on sea, which is fitting for this fight. They are, however, very inconveniently placed. It's hard to lure Dire Miralis to go to the specific Dragonators, especially the one on land. You need him right in the corner for it to hit. In terms of the fight with Dire Miralis itself, back in the day, honestly, I was never a huge fan, but after fighting him a bit recently, there are aspects of the fight I do enjoy. I like how as you break his parts and weaken him, his glowing parts disappear until he ends up like a lifeless rock. Visually seeing the progression within this battle is fun. It reminds me of fights with Agnaktor. The fight boils down to whittling down a tank bit by bit while dodging all his meteors and huge hitboxes. He's got some pretty deadly moves, but once you know what spots to avoid, he isn't so bad. He can enter armor mode when he's at lower HP that makes you bounce even at purple sharpness. I guess this would be like his version of a phase 2 for the fight. Overall, the fundamentals of the fight are pretty interesting, but I do feel like they could have done much more with this encounter to reach the same heights that the Ceadeus fight did, especially when it came to fighting him underwater. We've gone over all the underwater areas now, while covering some of the underwater enemies and touching some aspects of underwater combat. But now it's finally time to get a bit more in-depth with it. When it comes to the movement underwater, depending on which console you're playing on, you may have a completely different experience with the controls. With Monster Hunter Tri, you had the choice between Wiimote and Nunchuck, which use motion controls to do certain attacks, or a classic controller, which is just the regular control scheme most hunters are used to. With 3 Ultimate, if you played on the Wii U, you'd either have to deal with the gamepad or Pro Controller. However, if you played 3 Ultimate on 3DS, depending on which 3DS or 2DS model you had, you wouldn't have the C-Stick for camera use. I can definitely see people having issues playing on a 3DS without a C-Stick, and I can see issues with people playing on a Wii with the Wiimote and Nunchuck motion controls. However, when it comes to classic or Pro controls, I think maneuvering around underwater feels completely fine. I think a big problem with underwater movement comes with the awkward vertical dashes. If you angle your camera in a certain way, you can dash up and down, but it's hard to know sometimes when you hit that threshold. The easiest way to dash up and down is usually to input a dash in between weapon attacks, depending on the weapon of course. Not having a quick and easy way to traverse vertically while in combat is definitely detrimental to the underwater fighting experience. I think movement underwater in general feels sluggish compared to its grounded counterpart. Dashes feel short and aren't extended with the armor skill evade distance up like it does when on land for some reason. The evasion skill in general doesn't seem nearly as effective underwater. But there is an overlooked armor skill that I think should have been the norm for hunters in general, and that is Olympic Swimmer. A very simple and easy skill to gem in, and comes innately with a few armor sets in 3 Ultimate. Essentially, it just boosts your movement speed. It doesn't affect your dashes though, or Lance's underwater charge. However, I think the amount of movement speed you gain from it makes combat underwater a lot more manageable. The skill is a godsend for something like the first phase against Ceadeus, where keeping up with his swimming can make that part of the fight a lot easier. The skill is definitely something I don't see many people talk about when it comes to enhancing underwater combat, but in my opinion, if the movement speed of hunters was just this by default, I think that would have enhanced the underwater combat experience for everyone significantly. I think another big reason why underwater combat can be so polarizing for people is the fact that certain weapons are inherently stronger or weaker underwater. Tested each weapon's moveset grounded and compared it to their underwater versions. And as a side note, I'm showing weapon movesets from both Tri and 3 Ultimate. There are some minor changes between Tri and 3 Ultimate, so keep that in mind. 3 Ultimate has Hunting Horn, Dual Blades, Gun Lance, and Bow, which Tri does not. So for those weapons, the footage will be 3 Ultimate exclusive. Let's start with the Hunting Horn. Hunting Horn is a versatile weapon on land, and that translates very well underwater. For the most part, all of its attacks function the same. The movement speed buff from their songs also applies underwater, which can make yourself become quite the speedy bard. Overall, I see no glaring issues with this weapon underwater. Having a weapon function essentially the same on land and water is always good. Gun Lance. Compared to grounded combat, I actually feel slightly more mobile underwater, but the difference is minimal. Overall, the moveset is essentially identical. You still get to use your flashy explosions, so no problem here. Dual Blade. This is definitely an insane weapon underwater. The fact that you can dash roll that quickly while in Demon or Archdemon mode makes this one of the most mobile and versatile weapons underwater. Overall, the strength of grounded dual blades carries over, so if you're a dual blade fan, I'd like to say you're happy here. Greatsword. The moves underwater also work essentially the same. You do a little bit of a spin with your charge attacks, making the hitboxes a bit more lenient than its grounded counterpart. Also, their kick is now a tackle as well. I guess Hunter's feet are too busy keeping them propelled to be used for kicking. Sword and Shield, by far the most nerfed out of any underwater weapon. I have no idea what the Monster Hunter team had against this weapon, because on land it's actually really fun and versatile. The reason it's so bad underwater is not only the fact that their main combo is actually shortened, but the attacks themselves are much slower. A real shame. Hammer, another weapon that seems the same underwater, however, they are slightly nerfed when it comes to one of their charges. The distance covered by the level 2 charge is actually shortened, unfortunately, which sucks because as a hammer main, the distance you get from that charge feels so damn good on land. But overall, it still functions effectively the same. Lance, one of the best Blade Master weapons underwater. It is an absolute beast, especially its iteration Monster Hunter Tri, where you can stab 3 times and immediately counter and follow up with 3 more strikes again and again. This moveset works exactly the same underwater. With the dashes, hops, and the underwater version of the famous Lance Charge, you become a swift DPS machine and an immovable rock simultaneously. God damn, this weapon rules. Switch Axe, another weapon that functions essentially the same underwater. The reach in Axe mode can be used to your advantage when it comes to positioning yourself vertically underwater. Solid weapon for the seas. Longsword. In Monster Hunter Tri, Longsword is incredibly busted on land, and that strength carries over underwater. The amount of movement you get from your initial vertical slash is a great tool to approach monsters with. The directional fate slashes and the roll dashes that can be used to reposition after any attack makes this a great weapon on land and in water. Bow. To my knowledge, bow works essentially the same, except now in underwater you can position yourself above or below the monster to better hit your shots depending on your shot type. Range weapons in general are strong underwater, and that brings us to the most busted underwater weapon, the bowguns. In Tri, you can customize parts in your bowgun to make it either light, medium, or heavy, but you pick between light and heavy in 3 Ultimate. In 3 Ultimate, you have access to Siege mode, which lets you just unload a giant clip into any monster in your way. The actual ammunition works differently underwater than on land, and it's actually a lot stronger because of how clustered together the ammo is. Essentially, you can shred anything, especially with the heavy bowgun. You can see in this footage that this hunter is trivializing this Goldbeard Ceadeus fight with his heavy bowgun. If I were to pick the strongest weapon underwater, it's gotta be this. Also, I'd like to mention quickly, I never had any issues with underwater combat in regards to playing with other hunters, other than being hit by certain bowgun ammo. With great power comes great responsibility, it seems. So that covers all the weapons, and again, the difference between underwater and land can definitely make some hunters feel bad about their weapon choice for certain fights, and can explain how hunters would be adverse against fighting underwater. And not wanting to fight underwater brings us to the next section of underwater combat, which are the underwater monsters. We've already touched on Ceadeus and dire Miralis. The remaining monsters, including their variations, are Royal Ludrith, Gobul, Plesioth, and Lagiacrus. In Monster Hunter Tri, only 4 out of its 18 monster roster are fought partially or fully underwater, and for 3 Ultimate's 51 monster cast, only 11 monsters involve underwater as well. With only a fifth of the fights being underwater, it's easy to understand how some people get accustomed to grounded combat and dislike having to switch over to the underwater style for a handful of monsters. It doesn't help that monsters like Ludrith, Gobul, and Lagiacrus are much more mobile in the sea. When we talked about how sluggish movement can feel underwater earlier, that sluggish feeling is definitely amplified by how quick and agile these monsters are comparatively, and some of them are laughably easy to fight on land. Gobul, for example, is such a pushover when grounded that I often find myself hoping his AI would somehow make him jump onto land for a much easier hunt. But it does make sense that these monsters are so agile underwater. They are aquatic life after all. Of course they know how to move better on their home turf, but being harder to fight underwater and easier on land causes the average hunter to prefer avoiding underwater combat and in turn prefer to remain grounded. Lagiacrus is an interesting monster because in 3 Ultimate he gets 2 variations, one that you fight predominantly on land, and one that's underwater only, Ivory and Abyssal Lagiacrus respectively. They tried to give Ivory Lagiacrus new moves to give some new life to his grounded form, but in my opinion he's not nearly as agile or as intimidating as when he's underwater. Lagiacrus returned in Monster Hunter Generations, a 4th generation game with no underwater areas, and the fight was definitely not as exciting either. Lagiacrus hasn't been seen since his appearance in 4th gen. Well, technically there was leaked footage of them trying to add Lagiacrus in a Monster Hunter World tech demo, but due to technical issues they couldn't go through with it. A damn shame. However, I fear for how good the fight would have been if he was limited to grounded combat. He is the flagship monster of the seas, after all. Abyssal Lagiacrus is a spooky water-only fight where he can spawn tornadoes and make for a great encounter, and has some of my favorite color schemes, armor, and weapon designs they've ever made. And something interesting to note, if you put Abyssal Lagiacrus to sleep here, you can hear the same humming that is heard in the ruins and flooded forest. Perhaps it's music specifically for underwater ruins within the game. I think this might be the only fight where you can hear it since you can't put Ceadeus to sleep and you can't access this area until he breaks it open. Anyways, back to the final monster. Plesioth is an interesting case because I actually find him a bit easier to fight underwater. The verticality helps dodge a lot of his moves and hip checks. And in older Monster Hunter games, when Plesioth was underwater, you're unable to actually attack him. This makes his fight a bit more pleasant. Aside from the special case though, ultimately underwater monsters are more difficult to face in the sea than on land, and that is definitely a leading factor in people not enjoying underwater combat as much. On a personal note, I remember way back in the day, I played so much Tri and 3 Ultimate that I was getting burnt out from the underwater combat, and I thought Monster Hunter Portable 3rd was a godsend for not having anything to do with underwater. They got rid of Lagiacrus and Ceadeus, replaced Gobul with Nebelsnarf, but kept Royal Ludrith, limiting him only to the land. They got rid of certain areas that were underwater only in Deserted Island and Flooded Forest, but some of the underwater only areas remained. You could just walk on top of the water somehow. It was a little strange, but it worked. Portable 3rd was a great game, and if you really disliked underwater combat, this would be the perfect way for you to enjoy the 3rd generation without having to deal with that. But after revisiting Tri and 3 Ultimate, I honestly enjoy underwater combat a lot more. There are definitely aspects I didn't give enough credit. Over the course of this video, we've gone over some of the issues that underwater combat faces, but let's summarize. The general movement is too sluggish, especially when in contrast to the speed of most underwater enemies. Weapons are unbalanced underwater, leading to certain options being either too strong or weak compared to their grounded counterparts. Traversing the water vertically is not intuitive, and the camera can be clunky at times when it switches between under and above water, and when things are blocking your view in the foreground. Some areas feel too small and cramped when fighting monsters as well, and depending on which game you're playing and what console it's on, the controls can just be a bit too wacky. However, these games with underwater combat have shown to excel in introducing immersive and aesthetically stunning environments with plenty of interactability. Despite the issues that are within the combat itself, there are many moments where underwater combat shines. The Ceadeus battle proves that when things work underwater, they make for an incredible hunting experience. The potential for underwater battles and sieges are enormous. They can do so much with underwater combat if it was reintroduced, that to answer the main question of the video, I'd say yes, they should absolutely bring underwater combat back to Monster Hunter. But if underwater combat was re-implemented, what would change and how would they do it? If they address the issues I mentioned earlier, that would be a great start. Faster movement underwater, better balancing for weapons, camera functionality and controls that work fluidly, and areas with ample room to fight in would go a long way. I understand that certain moves have to look and work differently because at the end of the day, you're fighting underwater and not everything works the same when you're swimming and fighting, but they have done a great job with a lot of weapons shown earlier. The weapons that work essentially the same in sea and on land should be the gold standard. If the Monster Hunter series continues to use the wire bug, using a similar mechanic to move in fast bursts underwater would work well. Personally though, I feel like just faster movement and longer dashes would be enough. Fighting enemies that are more agile underwater is totally fine if your hunter becomes more agile too. At the bare minimum, combat needs to feel as good in water as it does on land, if not better to have people actually look forward to fighting while submerged. When they added jumping and flying around with aerial combat in the 4th generation, it felt completely fresh, and they need to recreate that feeling with underwater combat. They could also introduce something similar to a clutch claw just to perhaps close distances better and maybe have a way to incorporate mounting monsters. Mounting monsters is a lot more prominent in newer Monster Hunter games, so I feel like adding that to underwater combat, if done well, could be an exciting new feature. I'm not the biggest fan of Clutch Claw and Iceborne, but if they tweak it to be something fun underwater, I wouldn't mind. For weapons like Insect Glaive that have a lot of aerial mobility, they could just make the vertical movement underwater for IG users just as mobile. Another thing I'd like to see if underwater combat returned is well-crafted maps to fight these monsters in. 3rd gen maps are the pinnacle of design in my opinion, but newer games have to deal with the fact that there's no loading zones and have to deal with the verticality they've introduced. A great example of them having an issue with that is the flooded forest they reintroduced in Monster Hunter Rise. Because of the loading zone difference, the verticality, and the fact that underwater combat doesn't exist, the map, in my opinion, doesn't capture the magic that was in the original renditions. I understand they wanted a watery jungle biome, but it was strange to me that they'd bring back an unflooded flooded forest, even if they did that back in Portable 3rd. I'd like to see them go above and beyond for the underwater areas, because that's what I feel like they did in Tri and 3 Ultimate, and Monster Hunter deserves nothing less. Just like we witnessed earlier in this video, the Monster Hunter team put so much love and care into crafting the underwater world, and personally, I'd love to see it return as the new highlight of Monster Hunter's 6th generation. The potential is so immense, and if they put all their effort into it, they could make underwater combat truly incredible and something that's looked at by hunters with excitement instead of dread. Whew, that was a lot to talk about. There's so much when it comes to underwater mechanics and combat that this video became a lot longer than I expected it to be. I'd like to hear what you guys think about underwater combat and what changes you'd like to see if they brought it back. Thank you guys for watching, and feel free to subscribe if you're interested in more old school Monster Hunter content. See you soon and take care.